Hello, and welcome to Western Civ. In today's bonus author interview, I sit down with historian Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones and talk about his most recent book, Persians, the Age of the Great Kings. It's a book that I highly recommend, and if you enjoy the Persian Wars, if you enjoy Alexander the Great, then why not hear the entire story, but from the other side? As Llewellyn-Jones and I talk about in the interview, frequently in Western history, we tend to only get the West's side of the story. But that would be like only getting the American colonist side of the story in the American Revolution. It takes two to tango, and it takes two to fight a war. And as you'll see in this interview, what the book really does is shed light on all the misconceptions and half-truths that gets passed on. Herodotus, not calling anyone out, of course, and then just echo down the ages and become not just half-truths, but accepted realities. This book ameliorates that issue. There's a link to purchase the book in the show notes. It is available now. And so, after these quick messages, on to the interview. All right, so I'm sitting down with Professor Llewellyn-Jones. As I mentioned previously, we're going to be talking about the Persians, the Age of the Great Kings. I kind of wanted to start out by framing the conversation, because as I was reading the book, I kept thinking to myself, no, I've read Persian sources before. I've heard the stories of the servant whispering, to Darius 3 times a day, remember the Athenians. That's got to come from a Persian source. Of course, it's too exact. And then I thought, no, wait, that is Herodotus. Wait, that's not a Persian source at all. So to frame the conversation, I think it actually is important to talk about, why hasn't there been a major history written about the Persian Empire from the perspective of Persia? I can't think of one, at least not that's been written, for Western audiences.
No, I think you're right, and that's really why I came to this book. I've been studying and teaching ancient Persian history alongside, of course, classical Greek history for 30 years now. And one of the problems I was been facing, of course, in doing this was getting my students to understand that a lot of the source materials that we're dealing with are, of course, from a Greek point of view, and therefore tend to be very pejorative or at best dismissive. And so what I've been trying to do, alongside colleagues over the last 20 years, have been sort of gearing themselves up to look for alternative versions, to go back to the Persian sources proper. Back in 2007, a very eminent Persian historian, Emily Kurt, from the University College London, she published a huge source book of Persian sources themselves, which has proved to be phenomenally useful for teaching and learning purposes. And I just wanted to go further than that and to write a narrative based as much as I could on the Persian sources themselves, and to identify where the Greeks were giving us this very pejorative vision, which is sometimes simply skewered, to create a point. All history, of course, has got an agenda behind it, including the indigenous Persian sources. But I wanted to show where, Herodotus or Xenophon had their agendas, and what has that done to our understanding of Persian history. Let me give you an example of that. So, a very popular story that was told by Herodotus and then was repeated by numerous Greek and then later Roman historians was this story of when Xerxes is marching into Greece. He gets towards the Hellespont and he sees this beautiful tree, a plane tree, and straight away he falls in love with this tree, and he commands one of his guards to keep watch on it forever, and he puts necklaces around its branches and earrings and bracelets on its branches, and then goes off. And of course, this has been held as, this is crazy Xerxes falling in love with a tree, and it's been pastiched by Elian, and then even in the 18th century, of course, Handel, in his opera Xerxes, wrote this beautiful Largo about the craziness of Xerxes falling in love with a tree. Well, what sits behind this? There is a Persian version which sits behind this. It's not so crazy, and that's when we recognize the fact that for the Persians, as for many ancient Near Eastern societies, trees were considered sacred objects, and very often the Persians and other ancient Near Eastern people like the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Elamites, they cultivated sacred groves, and they actually offered offerings of gold, silver, plate to tree deities. So this probably sits behind the story that Herodotus was telling about Xerxes. Now there's two ways, therefore, of interpreting this, okay? Either Herodotus didn't understand the Persian version, or, more likely, he knew it and was deliberately misrepresenting it for his Athenian audience. Because let's not forget, Herodotus was born and bred as a Persian subject. He was born in Halicarnassus, which is part of the Persian Empire. So he must have known to a certain extent the ways of the Persians. And in some respects, he's very reliable on what he says, about some of their manners and customs. So when we read a story like this, we have to think, okay, there's an agenda sitting behind this. And what Herodotus is doing, of course, is creating Xerxes as the ultimate Oriental despot, crazed, deranged, addicted to luxury, addicted to fantasy, and that's what he's come up with. And the thing is, of course, the difficulty is the image is stuck. It's a very compelling image, right the way down to Zack Snyder's movie 300 or 300 Rise of an Empire. Where this kind of Xerxes there, this kind of god creature, this rather sexual king of bling, is really kind of the offspring of Herodotus, and certainly not the depiction of Xerxes that comes over from the indigenous Persian sources.
And I think that that's an important point from the book to kind of start to take away, is that we don't want to fall into the trap of thinking that, okay, well, yes, Herodotus certainly had an agenda, he was skewed. Yeah, I mean, he paints Xerxes becomes the archetype of the Eastern monarch, and you do see it carried through all the way to certain film versions, which are ludicrously over the top, of course. But you write in the novel, and this is a quotation, where does this image of a humiliated, defeated, defunct Persia take us? And I think it's important to remember that these sorts of things do continue to impact us even in the modern day, in terms of how we see the different civilizations and that East-West dichotomy. You talk about that a little bit in the book.
We've created a divide between the East and West, which is not necessarily ever there, of course, in antiquity, and as much today. I mean, in the late 1970s, a Palestinian-born academic, Edward Said, came up with a concept which we can apply to this. He called it Orientalism. And what he meant by that phrase was how the West has manufactured an image of the East as either being harbingers of terror and fear, or else they are languid, lazy, effeminate, sexualized. And really these motifs, which we can see are absolutely up and running in Herodotus already, still have a lasting effect down to today, of course. We only have to look at a news bulletin about anything that's happening in the Middle East, and we see either the media very lazily chooses to depict the Middle Easterners as terrorists or as imbeciles, and very little in between. And I think that's part of the legacy that we have to deal with when we acknowledge the strength of Greek historiography and the impact it has had on European and Western white civilization since antiquity.
Right. I mean, and you continue to see it through all the way, of course, throughout the Middle Ages as the caliphates rise in the East. And this image just gets sort of grafted on top. And you see, so the point that I'm trying to make for the listeners is that this idea just sort of gets copied and pasted, like almost like a piece of computer code that somebody said, okay, well, that works well. Well, we'll just copy and paste it into the new program.
Precisely, yeah. And it's lazy, and, it gets us absolutely nowhere. I mean, the staggering thing about the scholarly approach to all of this over the centuries has been really quite mind-blowing. I mean, from the age of the Enlightenment, so from the 18th century onwards, there's been this Western agenda to privilege, of course, white Eurocentric civilization, and that goes back to the study of the Greco-Persian Wars. So in the middle of the 19th century, for instance, John Stuart Mill, one of the really great sort of thinkers of the 19th century, actually said, in terms of British history, the Battle of Marathon, fought between the Greeks and the Persians, is of more importance than the Battle of Hastings. That's really quite a remarkable statement, isn't it? That essentially what he's saying there is our DNA, our sense of self, of who we are in the West, was made in that battle between the Greeks and the Romans the Greeks and the Persians, when the Greeks were victorious over Persian despotism, enslavement. This myth of the Hellenic freedom begins then, and it's never really died away. It's essentially what 300 is still all about. That's exactly what the movie's about. And from there on in, this has been repeated. This idea has been repeated time and time again in popular histories, in academic histories. I noted the other day I was in a bookshop and I saw my book on the shelf, and I was very pleased to see it there. But right next to it was another book which has just come out at the same time as me, and it was called The Battles That Saved the Free World, Marathon, Thermopylae and Salamis. And there's this incredible legacy of thinking about an us and them scenario, which actually was very absent from the Persian mind. They didn't see themselves in that kind of way at all.
Well, and I don't think a lot of classical people and people in antiquity necessarily would have seen it that way either. The idea of nationalism as a concept doesn't exist at that time. And it is interesting to think about. You're right. It's a myth. It's a myth of the free society versus, the despotism, because of course, Athens isn't a pure democracy. It's more of an oligarchy.
Far from it.
And if a complete slave society.
Precisely. If you really want to look at an oppressive society in antiquity, you just got to look at Sparta. It's all absolutely there, What's really interesting as well in the scholarship is how often underplayed is the fact that during the Persian Wars with the Greeks, how many Greek city-states actually sided with the Persians. It wasn't a war about Persia and Greece at all. Really important areas of Greece like Thebes, like Argos in the Peloponnese, were actually more prone to follow the Persians than they were to think about any life that could have followed under the Athenians or the Spartans. They really thought that the future ahead was with Persia. So it's not this kind of sharp divide that some historians would have us believe. There's no such thing as that. And I think that goes on as well into the way in which, if we play at speculation and think, okay, what would have happened if the Persians had incorporated Greece into their empire in 480, 479 BCE? Well, for me, I think that first of all, they wouldn't have really, crushed the rise of democracy, and I use that term really loosely in an Athenian context. After all, there were several democratic city-states already within the Persian Persian Empire in Asia Minor, and the Persians didn't change any of that system. In fact, they had a very laissez-faire attitude to political structures. I think what would have happened is that they probably would have made Athens a satrapal capital, so they would have governed the area from Athens, and I think that they would have gone into Sparta and reduced the Spartans to zilch. I think they would have destroyed Sparta. And what a different song we would be singing then. It would be a very, very different take on antiquity if that had happened. But it does show us, I think, that, there's a lot of scaremongering about the idea what would have happened had Persia taken over Greece. We would never have had democracy. We would never have had sculpture. We would never have had drama. We would never have had vase painting. That's absolute baloney, because it wasn't the Persian way to destroy the cultures that they came in contact with. They worked with the cultures, in fact, which makes them pretty unique for an empire in antiquity.
Well, you're absolutely right, and you certainly can't argue that we wouldn't have had history, because, as you point out, Herodotus was born in Halicarnassus, which he was a Persian citizen to start out his life. So, that in and of itself belies the contention that, all of this would have just simply gone away if Persia would have won. But let's jump into it a little bit more. Let's actually talk about them, because what I found amazing, and I always forget this in reading the book, is that it's really the story of classical Persia is really the story of one dynasty, the Achaemenids. And it's just a remarkable family business, as you call it, the Achaemenids, because you go back and they make it, 300 years more so. The Julio-Claudians don't get anywhere close to that.
Nowhere near it. Nowhere near it.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It truly is amazing. What I find remarkable is that in this 300-year period run by this family, there was no contender to take over their empire at all. There was nothing of a comparable size or scale that could have actually acted as a foe to them or a foil to them. They were quite unique. And I think that the question should never really be, why did the Persian Empire fall? The more interesting question, I think, is how did it last for so long? That's the incredible thing. A mature empire which went on for almost 300 years. Incredible.
Yeah, I think it is amazing to think about that. We'll ask about, the decline and fall later on, because any empire that falls has to decline before it does so, according to, Gibbon, which was then chiseled on the Ten Commandments, I guess, after the fact. But Cyrus the Great brings the Persian Empire into being for the first time. And there's a lot that we can talk about with Cyrus the Great, but there's so much that I thought I would just ask you, what do you think, what do we think is most impressive about him?
I think the speed and vision with which he put together an empire. He was born around about 500 BCE in southwestern Iran, in the area we call Fars province now, near Shiraz. And at the time, the Persians were very much a tribal confederacy. He was the leader of the Pasargadae tribe, a small but influential tribe in southwest Iran. They were being quite heavily influenced and bullied, I suppose, really is the word, by northern tribes in Iran, especially under the Medes. Probably your listeners have probably heard of those, who are based around the Caspian Sea. And because of a kind of Median incursion into tribal territories amongst the Persians, Cyrus managed to gather together for the first time in history, as far as we can see, a confederation of these Persian tribes with him as the head. In the book, I've called him a Khan, like Genghis Khan, just to remind us that these Persians were nomadic, horse-rearing, tribal peoples, and I think that's essentially what he was originally, was a Khan. But what's then incredible is he takes these tribes of Persians north, and he completely and utterly destroys the Median kingdom, and therefore the empire that the Medes had put together for themselves suddenly fell into his hands. Now, this empire stretched from the Caspian Sea around modern-day Tehran right the way up to the center of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, up to the river Hylas. So suddenly, within, maybe 5 years, Cyrus found himself being the ruler not just of this tribal confederacy, but suddenly of big, big swathes of land way beyond the Zagros Mountains. Well, the incredible thing about him then is, rather than just being satisfied with that, he gets this kind of this feeling for building up more, and so he crosses the Hylas River with his armies, and he invades Asia Minor, the whole of Asia Minor. He takes over the kingdom of Lydia and its principal city of Sardis, which in antiquity, of course, was ruled by Croesus. Croesus, whose name is synonymous with wealth. Sardis was the richest city in the ancient world. Well, this falls to the Persians almost within 6 months. And so Cyrus finds himself, so now we're down to about 6 or 7 years after starting, with this huge empire which is suddenly falling into his hands. But again, he thinks, okay, I can go further with this. And so rather than marching his soldiers home into Iran, instead he marches them down the Euphrates River into Babylonia. And there he captures several Babylonian cities, ending up, of course, with Babylon itself. And Babylon at this time was the greatest metropolis on earth. I mean, it was the super city of all cities at this period. And with the fall of Babylon, what we also get, of course, is the fall of the whole of the Neo-Babylonian Empire to Cyrus. So that's land right the way across into modern-day Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, almost to the borders of Egypt and northern Arabia as well. All of this really in 10 years. Now that's phenomenal, isn't it? And whether it's a kind of planned conquest or whether it actually it's opportunistic, which I think it was, it's still a matter of genius, really, that he managed to quell and, more importantly, stabilize all of these lands within a decade. It's really incredible that he suddenly took to the idea of imperialism and instituted a reliable, safe, and workable way of keeping those conquered peoples under control without rebellion. It's really quite remarkable. Sometimes I think the title "The Great" is thrown around too much in ancient history, but I do believe with Cyrus there's a man who really does deserve it. It's a phenomenal feats that he undertook.
I think it's ironic then that for all that he did to build the Persian Empire in the beginning, that we don't have any, I'll call them, domestic sources for his death. Everything comes from foreign sources. Is there a certain irony in that?
There certainly is, and I think this is one of the frustrations, but also one of the opportunities of working in Persian studies. The Persians had no written narrative histories of their own. They never bothered with writing histories in the way that the Greeks did. And that's because, like the Greeks and many other peoples before the invention of writing, their histories were told in poetic form through oral traditions. And so there must have been, during Cyrus's own lifetime, numerous stories told of him. And of course, in the decades after his death, legends would have grown up and legends would have morphed into myths. Herodotus himself tells us that he knows of 4 stories about Cyrus's birth, for instance. And then preserved in the Greek tradition, we have at least 3 stories of his death. Sometimes two stories, he's on his deathbed in his palace. Another story says he died on campaign in the east. Well, clearly he can't die in bed and on campaign at the same time. So what we've got in these stories, I think, are propaganda story, sort of localized stories of Cyrus that were probably told by the Persians themselves and have been filtered down to the Greeks in various, sometimes broken, sometimes misunderstood ways. But I think what it opens up the possibility for us to think about is that the Persians had a very rich transmission process of history. And it's not that the Persians didn't know their history, it's just that they chose to remember it differently to the Western way. And we really see that. And if your listeners haven't ever come across this particular book, I urge them to look at it. In about 1000 AD, a wonderful Persian poet called Ferdowsi, he penned an epic poem called the Shahnameh, the Epic of Kings or the Book of Kings. It's a vast, vast, rambling history of pre-Islamic Persia. And the Achaemenid kings are there. They're often under different names, or names which have sort of resonances. So Darius, for instance, is Dara. We hear him like that. But that's the first time that the Persians attempted to write a history of their own peoples, and they opt to do it, of course, in poetic form. And I think that really gets to the heart of how the stories of Cyrus have come down to us. It must have been transmitted in many, many different ways.
Well, let's talk for a second about the empire in terms of how it was constituted and how it was organized, and how that compares. The Roman Empire is sort of it tends to be sort of the North Star that every empire gets compared to. And it almost seemed to me like the Persians had developed a more efficient system for running their empire in a couple of different ways. So I was wondering if you could talk about that for a second.
Sure, I certainly think you're right. First of all, let me give you a size of the empire. Let give your listeners an idea of that. So the empire expands from at the center of the empire, of course, is what we call the Iran. To the west, it goes to the deserts of North Africa, so to Libya, the whole of Egypt, down the Nile into Ethiopia. To the north, it extends to the Ukraine. To the east, it goes to Afghanistan and Pakistan, and into northern India as well. So it was the biggest empire the world had ever seen. And what's remarkable about it is the way in which it was run was so coherent. And it was run by satraps. So the king would appoint local officials in different areas of the empire. They were responsible for collecting taxes to make sure that the will of the king was carried out. And the satraps were responsible for reporting back directly to the king at the center. Roads interconnected all of these countries and all of the main satrapal centers. I mean, great roads with kind of service stations situated every 20 miles, and a horse courier service, which Herodotus was completely in awe of. You could travel from Sardis in Turkey right the way down to Persepolis in central Iran in about 19 days. You could get a message through, which is pretty phenomenal for antiquity. It's the equivalent of our sort of broadband system, really. Also, sea routes were very important, as were rivers. One of the incredible feats of engineering undertaken in antiquity was when Darius the Great created a canal which ran from the Nile to the Red Sea, which enabled, therefore, the journey between Egypt and southern Iran through the Persian Gulf to be done in a matter of weeks. He also, of course, cut a canal in the north of Greece as well. And the idea there was that basically he could circumnavigate the whole of his empire had Greece fallen to him without stop. There was no end to this. And then there are other really, really practical things which the Persians implemented on their empire, which is very telling of the way in which they regarded their empire. So to begin with, they never forced their subjects to use the Persian language. They allowed the continuation of indigenous languages. And for bureaucracy, they utilized the old Semitic language of Aramaic. Now, Aramaic was already around in the Assyrian Empire, and it remained a very strong language right the way up until the 2nd century AD. Jesus of Nazareth would have spoken Aramaic. This became the lingua franca of the empire, and it meant that whether you were dealing with civil servants in Memphis in Egypt or in Bactra in Afghanistan, all the language of the empire was filtered through this one language. So, communication, therefore, was easy, and which is a brilliant thing to do. Why I say it's unusual for antiquity, or indeed for other empires, if you think about the Roman Empire, the Romans imposed Latin on all of its conquered peoples. If you couldn't speak Latin, you were a nothing in the Roman Empire. You couldn't achieve anything. Likewise under the British, of course, So, Queen Victoria's English went all over the British Empire, and civil servants from Bombay to Calcutta to Zimbabwe all had to speak English. Now that says a lot, doesn't it, about the way in which Rome and Britain saw itself in this time superior culturally to the conquered peoples. We see it also, of course, in architecture too. You can go from Hadrian's Wall to Syria in the Roman Empire and see the presence of Rome in its temples, in its circuses, in its fora, which are imposed on the landscape of no matter where you are. And likewise in the British Empire, of course, British bungalows and British colonial buildings dot India and South Africa and Canada to this day. The Persians never did any of those things. They never they never impose their language, their architecture, their religion, any kind of ideology on the conquered peoples. They work with the locals. Now, I'm not a fan of empire. I don't think it's a good thing. I would prefer all peoples to be free and to make their own decisions. But I sure would have preferred to have lived under the Persians than the Romans, that's for sure, because I think, and this is the tragedy, I think, of where we're at in our knowledge of antiquity and what we do with it in this modern age. In Britain, in the 19th and 20th and up to the 21st centuries, Greek and Latin, of course, classical civilization was the cornerstone of education in elite schools for male, white, upper-class individuals, okay? We have a prime minister here in Britain at the moment who is a product of that school, who uses his mangled Greek and Latin as a kind of social distancing tool, to keep the classes in their place. As you know, Britain is a very class-conscious society. And that's because, of course, the archetype of Rome was taught to our British ancestors as the way to run an empire, and so the British ran their empire on those lines too. Isn't it a great shame that in these great scholastic institutions of the 19th and 20th century, the Persian Empire hadn't been taught alongside, because at least it could have given us a different blueprint for what an empire could have been. And while no empires are built and maintained without bloodshed, at least for millions of people around the world, they might have had a more dignified experience of empire than the one that they've actually did end up having, of course.
I think there's so much there, and there's so much more in the book that you get into, and it's very effective. King of Kings really did mean something to the Persians. There's no, of course, they didn't refer to themselves as emperors, but there's no Roman emperor of emperors. There's a couple of points in the book when you talk about the multiculturalism of the Persian Empire, and the reliefs and descriptions where they are listing all of the individual ethnicities that make up the Persian Empire. There's no effort to do that ever in the Roman Empire. You're either Roman or you're not, and that's it. And so it's a very different model, and just because it's different than the Romans doesn't mean that it's wrong. And I think that we got to shake ourselves of that idea. But kind of moving on here, I have picked up plenty of survey histories in my life that go straight from Cyrus the Great to Darius the Great and make simply no message of Cambyses in between. He's an interesting guy, but do you think he suffers the most from what I'll call a lack of local press? Because I think he did a lot.
He did a lot. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we're more au fait now with how Herodotus works with Xerxes and what he does with him, less so with Cambyses. So readers who go into book 2 of the Histories and suddenly deal with Cambyses just see this slice of absolute crazy. That's all he comes across as a mad king. It's on a sort of 1066 level of madness, really. What we actually now know about Cambyses comes, of course, from looking at the indigenous Persian and Egyptian evidence. Cambyses conquered Egypt. His father, Cyrus, never got round to that. Now, that's no small feat in itself, okay? Egypt, I mean, probably the wealthiest country in antiquity, and certainly the breadbasket of antiquity. Egypt was able to feed the rest of the ancient world. So taking Egypt, and very quickly as well, within maybe 6 short months, Egypt fell to Cambyses is no bad thing. Herodotus must have visited Egypt about 100 years after Cambyses, which was a time actually when Egypt had broken away from the Persian Empire. It was conquered again afterwards. But in this period of sort of liberation from Egypt, from Persia, I think the Egyptians were going through an anti-Persian phase. And so there's a lot of sort of propaganda being drawn out around the first invasion by Cambyses, depicting him as this crazed despot, out of control completely and unfit to rule. But now that we have the Egyptian evidence, we see things are completely different. So one of the stories that Herodotus really likes to tell, and he gets a lot of mileage out, is how Cambyses committed acts of sacrilege against the Egyptian gods. So, he's supposed to have pilfered from temples, he's supposed to have destroyed cult images, and the worst thing of all is he's supposed to have killed the Apis bull. Now, the Apis bull was considered to be the living manifestation of one of the creator gods, Ptah. The Apis bull was a real bull. He had certain markings, and he lived a life of luxury at Saqqara in a beautiful kind of paddock, and he had his own harem of heifers and so forth. But when this bull died, he was supposed to be interred in huge sarcophagi, and these still exist in Saqqara today. And then Ptah would enter the body of a new bull. And so, like sort of looking for the Dalai Lama, the Egyptian priests would then go out and look for the next incarnation of Ptah in the next Apis. Well, this was a holy, sacred, and very special element of Egyptian worship. And Herodotus tells this sacrilegious tale then when Cambyses one day in one of his furies slaughters this bull. Well, now we know, of course, there is no truth in this, because we found from the Serapeum at Memphis a series of stelae which represent Cambyses himself depicted as a pharaoh worshipping the Apis bull, and we found depictions of Cambyses actually welcoming the new Apis bull into its place. In other words, Cambyses, like all the other Persian kings after him in Egypt, completely adapted and adopted pharaonic traditions. They wanted to be seen as pharaohs. And this is one of the really interesting things, again, which puts us out of step with the Romans or the British, is that the Persians were more than comfortable in adapting to the local traditions, even in the vision of kingship itself. So while Darius or Cambyses or Xerxes can be king of kings in Persia, In Egypt, they are king of Upper and Lower Egypt, lord of the two lands. They adapt all of those titles. In Babylon, they are king of the four quarters of the world. They go along with the local kingly traditions. Darius the Great, for instance, even builds temples in the Kharga oasis to the Egyptian gods Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, the moon god. So it shows that they must have been working, of course, with the nobility of Egypt, and especially with the powerful priesthood, in order for those kind of images to be created. So we can, now that we know how to look for this Persian evidence, including Egyptian indigenous evidence, we can entirely dismiss Herodotus's really quite offensive image of Cambyses. It just doesn't hold up any longer at all.
And as much as we have to revisit the image of him in general, there's the problematic aspects of his death. How much can we honestly say for certain that we know what happened between his death and the rise to power of Darius the Great?
It's one of the most complex questions in all of antiquity, I think. We can only speculate and go with the sources that we have, which of course include Herodotus, but also for the first time we have a long written narrative historical text in the Persian version as well. So carved into the Mount of Bisitun in northern Iran, Darius the Great left this large inscription talking about how he acquired the throne. In the book, I've called it an amalgamation of alternative facts. That's basically what we're dealing with there. Darius the Great was one of the great PR spin doctors of history, I would say. And he gives us in this narrative, carved into the living stone, his own version of what happened. There's a really intriguing line in the Bisitun inscription, which says, Cambyses, he died his own death. That's a really ambiguous line. What does it mean? Well, it could mean suicide. Cambyses committed suicide. It could mean he deserved the death he got, whatever that might have been. Herodotus tells us that while mounting his horse one day, actually on the path from leaving Egypt to go back to Persia, where he heard there was a rebellion by his brother, Herodotus tells us as he got onto his horse, a dagger that he was wearing at his waist plunged into his thigh. And Herodotus, of course, says, well, that's the gods getting their own back for him having plunged a dagger into the Apis bull, which we just spoken about. And then over the next progressive weeks, as he rides back towards Syria, it becomes gangrenous and he dies of blood poisoning. Now, there's a possibility that that's the truth. There is also, though, the possibility that he was, in fact, bumped off by Darius himself. He had been one of Darius's bodyguards. Darius had been one of Cambyses' bodyguards, interestingly. And, there's that odd adage, isn't there, of, keep your enemies close when your friends closer still. So I think there could be a play about that. But what is really meant by Cambyses, he died his own death, is still really perplexing. There's a possibility, though, that Darius was a regicide, not just once but twice. He certainly killed Cambyses' younger brother, who was the heir to the throne, of course, Bardia, and it's possible, therefore, that he also killed Cambyses as well.
Well, I want to get to what the Greeks call the Persian Wars before we run out of time, because, of course, from the Greek perspective, this is, World War 50. I mean, this is the most epic clash of civilizations in history and dictates everything thereafter. And the Golden Age comes, post Salamis and so on, Plataea and so on and so forth. But I'm curious as to it's almost as if you only had the American Revolution from the perspective of the Americans and you never got the British perspective. It's very similar to that. So I'm just curious as to what we can say about how seriously did Darius at first take this, and then Xerxes, and how did the Persians see this conflict with the different city-states of Greece? By the way, I want to be clear. This isn't the nation-state of Greece versus the Persian Empire. It's a couple of the city-states. It's not everybody. So what can we say about it?
Well, in my estimation, that story that you opened with, where a servant repeats to Darius, 3 times a day, "Sire, remember the Athenians," could only have been written by a pro-Athenian like Herodotus for an Athenian audience, right? Because, let's face facts, the Athenians were probably the furthest thing from Darius's mind on a daily basis. He had far bigger fish to fry. Marathon was a minor skirmish on the far-flung outpost of the empire, nothing more than that. It was kind of annoying for Darius because he moved troops to the Western Empire when actually they could have been used to quell and bring into the empire more of India. That's the consequence, I think, of Marathon and what we call the Ionian Revolt, which actually, again, was just a series of border skirmishes. For the invasion under Xerxes, we can't dismiss it, of course, because Xerxes decided to go at the head of his army himself. And, of course, he brought all of his relatives on this as well. This is not just his personal war, it's a dynastic war as well. So his brothers, his stepbrothers, his half-brothers were all included in the army and the navy for this invasion. It was seen as a dynastic war. But, there is no account of the war in any Persian sources whatsoever. That's not because it wasn't important to them per se, but as far as they were concerned, it was kind of mission accomplished. So, okay, Greece, the Greek city-states weren't all brought into the orbit of the empire, but many of them already were there anyway. But if you think about it from Xerxes' perspective, he went out to crush opposition at Thermopylae when he effectively killed Leonidas, one of the Spartan kings there. It was mission accomplished. As far as Xerxes was concerned, Leonidas, like other rebellious subjects, was a liar king. The Persians divided their world into 2 halves. There were those who followed Arta, the concept of truth, and that means also loyalty to the king. It means to be godly, to observe the gods. And then if you were not followers of Arta, you were followers of Drauga, which means the lie, disorder, rebellion, ungodliness. Leonidas and the Spartans were certainly, from Xerxes' perspective, followers of the lie. So the killing of a liar king, as Darius had done in his reign, was a good thing. That brought order back to the world again. So, as far as Xerxes was concerned, mission accomplished at Thermopylae. Then he goes down into Athens, and again, really, it's mission accomplished one more time as well. He sacks Athens, he reduces it to ashes, really, and that's it. That's really what he wanted. Now, it's a shame about Salamis, and interestingly, Herodotus himself says that the Battle of Salamis was fought on a lie. Themistocles lured Xerxes into the straits on the back of a lie. And I think there Herodotus is very well aware of this polarity in the Persian mind and plays on it, essentially. That's where it all goes wrong for Xerxes, and he returns back to Babylonia because actually there's unrest in Babylon. He's more concerned with putting down Babylon than staying in Greece any longer. He's not going to spend more of his time or his money there. So I think in many respects, Xerxes achieved what he really wanted to do. There's an interesting series of inscriptions which were carved by Xerxes in the post-Greek years, in which he talks more and more about trouble in the empire, and that in order to for the empire to work successfully, the peoples of the empire must not worship or follow Daiva. The word Daiva in Old Persian means kind of false gods or lies or spirits or whatever. So it's almost as though Xerxes is saying, look, we didn't get Greece, the whole of it. Most of it is ours. But, these people are still there and they are ungodly. There's a recognition that they are not part of the empire, not part of the same world as him. But I don't think it was that the Greek wars were anything like a failure for Xerxes. I don't think he went as Aeschylus imagined him in the play Persi, the Persians of 472 BC, going home to Persia in rags with his tail between his legs. I don't think it was that. I think it was still shown as a victory, very much so, in fact. There's no evidence that the empire was in any danger, post-Salamis, of collapsing or of the peoples of the empire turning their back on Xerxes.
Well, I think that there's something important there again, just to make reference to, is that we have this assumption, oftentimes coming from the West, that West is where the important stuff is. That's the important theater of war. But what we forget is that the Persians ruled an empire that was in many ways Eastern facing. They were concerned with expansion into India, with things that were coming in from Bactria and so on and so forth. It's not as though, Cyrus conquers Lydia and moves the capital to Lydia, or moves the capital to Sardis, because, well, this is obviously the important side of the world. It is, from the Roman perspective, because the Euphrates and what's going to be the Parthians are kind of the border. They are the eastern border. But the Parthians have an eastern border that goes so much further that they have to care about, and that they do care about.
Absolutely. And it's just an accident of history, really. The majority of our narrative histories that we so enjoy reading and we get a lot out of are, of course, from the western part of the empire. There's a real imbalance in our sources that is being addressed. We are finding more and more archival sources from the eastern part of the empire, which is putting things into perspective for us more and more. But we always know that that when a crown prince, for instance, was being tutored for governance by his father, the king, they would often be put as satraps in the eastern provinces, Parthia or Bactria, because that was the really vital aspect of the empire. It's that link, I think, between the Eastern Empire, the steppes of Eurasia, and that world of nomadism, which is really important to the Persians. And we should never forget that the Persians never forgot their nomadic roots. They were essentially peripatetic peoples, and I think they always naturally looked towards the east as their centre of gravity. It's our Western bias that has drawn the historiography back to Asia Minor and into Greece.
Well, and speaking of Western bias, I wanted to probably end with one more question. I'm really interested in this point because you write in the book, this is a quote, that many scholars still insist that Plataea was the beginning of the end for the Persian Empire, and that its slide into decadence, corruption, and inertia started with Xerxes' defeat. This approach makes no sense. I think that that's really important to touch on for a moment, because there are a lot of histories that do sort of mark Xerxes' defeat in, again, from the Greeks' perspective, the Persian Wars as the beginning of the end of the Persian Empire. And the reality is there's simply no evidence to support that.
No. Absolutely not. And in fact, the empire is still going to run for another 120 years yet. There's a long way to go before Alexander gets there. And in fact, under Darius II, it really reaches a new kind of apogee. And then what's really remarkable is the two sort of big player kings at the end of the empire, Artaxerxes III and Darius III, were actually very, very competent military leaders and very competent administrators as well. Artaxerxes III brings Egypt back into the Persian Empire again, which really bolstered self-confidence, of the Persians. And Darius III, of course, comes down to us mainly from the classical sources because he's the opponent of Alexander. He gets really bad press, again, in the Alexander histories, where he's often seen as cowardly and so forth. But we know from Babylonian sources in particular that actually he was a very fine military general in his own right before he'd even been appointed as king. And he continued to have that prestige right the way through his reign. The classical authors depict the kind of, him fleeing away first from Issus and then from Gaugamela as acts as cowardice. I see them as being absolutely pragmatic. We said at the beginning, this empire operates around the family itself. He is the center of that family. He is the great dynast. If the Achaemenids continue, he has to live through this. And what we see is, right up until his death, that he is constantly rearming his men, constantly resupplying them, constantly finding new soldiery, always aiming to basically wear Alexander out. It's not a wild goose chase that he leads Alexander on. He wants to bring him into the mountains of Bactria to essentially undertake guerrilla warfare there and bring the Macedonians to heal through exhaustion more than anything else. The sad thing is, of course, and we should remember, it's not Alexander who kills Darius III, but it's actually Bessus, one of his own men, probably his cousin as well. So as ever, the problem that the Achaemenid family faced was actually internal rebellions within members of the family, not outside forces, which I think is worth remembering. And, we talked a little bit about the idea of decline and fall. Well, I think you're right. This has become the kind of, again, a touchstone in historiography, from Gibbon on, that surely there must be a time after the apex of an empire that we go into a period of decadence and decline. So Gibbon, of course, for Rome says, essentially says from Nero onwards, all these emperors tend to be running to bad. And likewise, the historiography about Persia has said from Xerxes onwards, all these kings are ruled by concubines and eunuchs. It's all going a bit crazy. They're all despotic. They're all too lazy to rule. Well, of course, that really isn't true. And the empire was as buoyant and as demonstrative in power at the time of Alexander's conquest as it was at the time of Darius the Great. I do not think that the idea that Alexander comes in and kind of finishes off an already moribund, dying Persian Empire is true. He comes in and mugs the empire, I think, and holds it to ransom and then slits its throat. It is a really fast conquest, which is down to Alexander's superiority as a military man, as a general, as a tactician, and just the kind of guts and bravado that Alexander has. The Persians simply don't see that coming. But there is no credibility can be given to this idea that Persia was in decline. And we know that especially from a series of documents that have been discovered in Bactria, one of these rare Eastern archives. They actually come from the satrap of Bactria, and they show a series of letters and tax returns between the reigns of Artaxerxes III, Darius III, and into the opening years of the reign of Alexander. And they show that things are unchanged. There is no change in the economic, fiscal system, in the political system. Alexander inherits a system which is working extremely well. We do not see it plunge, and Alexander have to rebuild it or replace Persians with his Macedonians or anything. He leaves the system as it is because it's working, which completely and utterly contradicts the Alexander historians and the historiography for hundreds of years that have been written about this slow, cruel, painful decline that Persia underwent.
Yeah, and I think that belies another one of the mistakes that we make very often when we're trying to simplify history, which is we have a tendency to draw lines on a map and then color in huge swaths of, well, this is now Greece, as though or Hellenic Empire, as though someone went around to every single goat herd and said, here's your new identification card. Welcome to Alexander's empire. We do this a lot in colonial periods, North America, you've got, usually England is red, so you've got this whole red part here, and then you got this big blue chunk in the middle, as though there's French people up and down the Mississippi, which of course there
Precisely. Absolutely. Yeah. And, to continue your analogy, if you went to some shepherd in the back of Beyond and said, today you're an Achaemenid, but tomorrow you're going to be a Macedonian, and in the future you're going to be a Seleucid. Well, what's that to a sheep herder, in the back of Beyond? It's not going to make any difference to them at all, is it? Yeah, you're right. I mean, identity in antiquity and later did not work in that way at all.
Well, we didn't talk about a lot of stuff. We barely talked about Alexander, but is there anything, that glaring thing that you think that we missed?
I don't think so. One thing I think that maybe it's important to say is that we do have sources from Persia which are absolutely and utterly unique to Persia and give us a completely new platform for discussion. And these are the many thousands of cuneiform tablets that were discovered in Persepolis and Susa and other locales as well. These tend to be bureaucratic texts, administrative texts. They very often deal with food rations, people moving about the empires, but these are the proper indigenous Persian version sources which tell us all sorts of things about the interior running of the empire, including things like the position of women in Persian society and certainly about women in the royal court, about slavery. Persia was as much a slave state as any other ancient state. And I think if you really want to understand how Persia operated and thought, these texts, we have over 30,000 of them. These are the go-to sources, and these are the things that we as Persian historians are working on day by day, and we're learning so much from them. And of course, individual histories, new place names, new events are coming from these sources on a monthly basis, and they are completely unique. They are not referenced in the Greek sources, in the Latin sources, or in anything else at all. They stand independently as the Persian version of history, and I find them really exciting.
And that's why it's so exciting to read a narrative version of the history that brings all those sources together, which is precisely what you've done here in this book. Well, as I mentioned, we scratched the surface. It's an incredible book, and I hope that people pick it up and enjoy it. I will say this, if you've only read Western-oriented histories of the Persian Wars, Alexander, you name it, it's absolutely worth picking up to get the full picture of everything that happened. But thank you so much for joining me. I think it was a great talk.
Well, you're very welcome, Adam, and I'm glad you enjoyed the book, and I hope that your listeners will as well, and maybe we can pick up this another time in the future.